Well, firstly, I just wanted to say, thank you very much for doing this. I'm really fascinated to talk to you because you've been in the Bitcoin space way longer than I have, and I think way longer than most of the people that, I kind of come across on the scene. And I'm actually quite curious to talk to you a little bit about the history and the trajectory that you've seen of Bitcoin.
Yeah,
And I guess also editing at Forbes, you've got a massive insight into just some of the trends that you've seen. Um, so yeah, I'm really curious I guess if you could just kick off by introducing yourself and then maybe just talk a bit about your orange pill journey and how you actually came into this space.
for sure. So my name is pronounced Leigh Cuen. I know it's spelled really funky, but it's gonna age me a little bit. Imagine Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, the old TV show. That's what my name is pronounced like. And in terms of my orange pill journey, I first learned about Bitcoin in 2015 when I was working as a journalist in the Middle East. I found it to be a really fascinating concept, but then I didn't start really digging in full time until 2017 when I was working at Newsweek Media Group. I had moved to New York, so back to the US. My bosses asked me to cover the blockchain industry because it's really hard to fact check. And I have a lot of experience with complex fact checking from my previous experience in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I was a political reporter
Oh,
and a culture writer, so no tech background at all when I came into Bitcoin. Um,
wow. Oh my gosh, that's
mhm.
fascinating. So you were reporting on that conflict way back when?
Yeah. I was living in the Middle East for 5 years, covering that conflict, and that was actually where I first heard about Bitcoin. Um, So
Huh.
when I came back to the US and my bosses were like, this is really hard. Leigh is used to doing hard things. Let's just give her all the Bitcoin content. Um, I liked it because it allowed me to do a lot of original research instead of just aggregation, which is a lot of news production these days. And I fell in love with writing about Bitcoin in particular, especially stories about how different marginalized groups or international groups are using the technology in really innovative ways. So fast forward to now, I've been publishing and editing content about Bitcoin for roughly 6 years. I also helped run Bitcoin focused mentorship programs through a grassroots community called Des Femmes, which started in 2021. In 2021, I also co-founded the Association of Cryptocurrency Journalists and Researchers to help other writers like me find resources when they start their Bitcoin journey, because it can be really, as I'm sure you know, like drinking straight from a fire hose when you start your orange pill discovery. And then in 2022, I worked with the Human Rights Foundation to research Bitcoin usage among human rights activists around the world. Um,
Wow.
I pers- I really like using this tool. It's useful. It's fun. It opens up new doors for me. It's been an avenue for me to learn personally about computer science and economics, and it's helped me become better at my job personally, I think. And like, for example, sometimes in addition to my day job, which I today work at Forbes editing Bitcoin related content and general fintech content, anything financial technology, so banking apps, that kind of stuff. But sometimes on top of my day job, I might offer personalized career coaching or poetry commissions in exchange for a little bit of Bitcoin. And that can be a fun and flexible way to earn money. So that's just a little bit about my background, I guess, how I came into this space.
That's amazing. Actually, before we dive into, I'm curious as to what got you hooked on Bitcoin, but how did you end up being a journalist? What was that career path like?
Oh, my way of being a journalist was very boring. I just wanted to do that ever since I was a child. I really like to write, and so I asked my mom as a kid, what can I do to write for a living? And she said, poets don't make any money. So I said I'd become a journalist. I was one of the first freshmen in my high school class to be part of the school newspaper. I interned at the local newspaper when I was 16. I went to school for journalism, so I've just pretty much been doing this since I was a teenager. Um,
Wow.
but for Bitcoin in particular, I think the thing that I really liked about it was the idea, because I was living internationally, right? I was living in the Middle East, and I was a dual citizen, and I dealt with all of the uh, both traumatic and hilarious situations that you have when you're wiring money back and forth just trying to live as an international person. So the idea of international money made a lot of sense to me, and I found it really fascinating. And also, in the Middle East, there's a lot of banking discrimination for various groups, and so I saw how some of those groups were using Bitcoin. And so that was the part that was really fascinating to me. I didn't even consider, it appreciating in value, for example. Like it didn't occur to me that I would, trading or all these other things that a lot of people are really attracted by. That wasn't what necessarily attracted me. What attracted me was the idea of being able to have my money with me wherever I went, in a safe and discreet way. While if I were to like take a suitcase full of cash across a border for a reporting trip, that would be increasing my risk, my personal safety risk. So that was why I initially thought Bitcoin sounded so interesting.
Yeah, it's actually amazing to me how many people are interested in number go up and seem to completely miss the point of having an asset that you can self-custody and like the value of that. And I think they probably just haven't experienced enough sort of financial trauma with the banking system or
good
just...
for them.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to me because I mean, I come from a TradFi background. I worked in financial markets for 20 years. And for me, I mean, we had a lot to do with blockchain and sort of that kind of technology. There was lots of, obviously all the banks are looking at different ways of utilizing it. And I didn't really understand the value prop of it. And it was actually in 2021 when I watched a Jordan Peterson interview with 4 Bitcoiners. And it was just suddenly like this, like the veil of ignorance was lifted. And I was just like, oh my God, I've spent 20 years in financial markets and I understand nothing about money. And it was just like this massive revelation. And then from that day, I mean, literally after the 90-minute video, I was just like, I'm obsessed. Like, this is just incredible. But it never once occurred to me that I was going to get rich off of it. I was just like, this is an incredible technology that deserves to see the light of day. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting that you've had a similar journey in terms of seeing its value, the applications that it can have. What's the adoption like in the Middle East then? So presumably you were, I'm assuming you were staying in Israel and not Gaza when you were doing the journalism, but did you see a lot of usage and adoption? What was it like?
So I also spent a lot of time working in Jerusalem and in the West Bank. I would not say that the average person owns Bitcoin, but I would say the people who do usually have a fascinating story. I met people who were mining Bitcoin in the basement of a refugee camp, people who were unbanked and they couldn't get a bank account because of racial discrimination in Jerusalem. From the Israeli banks, for example, considered them too risky. The Palestinian banks considered them a traitor for continuing to live under Israeli rule. But Bitcoin was a way for them to transfer assets with their international family members. A lot of Palestinians have family in diaspora, so living in Jordan, living in California, wherever it is. And for Israelis are, very tech savvy. Israelis are incredibly curious, open-minded. And so I was fascinated by the way that there was so much red tape for Israelis and Palestinians to do work together via a bank, like even to open a bank account together, for example. You can do it, but there's red tape. But there was if you personally are not discriminating against Palestinian, there's nothing stopping you from transacting with them using Bitcoin. And I know a lot of people who do that. So that's something, it's not everyone, it's certainly not everyone, but you know what? Not everyone in the world owns the shekel, and we still consider the Israeli shekel to be a useful, reliable tool. So I think for the people who do use it, it's just considered a lifeline.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, that's really fascinating. Do you think that the understanding in that region of the differences between Bitcoin and other crypto more generally is much more prevalent?
Nah, I would say that people learn the hard way. But I will say that something I used to, I guess, really feel upset about that because so many people lose so much money to scams. But then I talked to a lot of people who were like, you know what, I learned, and that's how I learned about self-custody, and that's how I learned, how to evaluate when there's actually a good Bitcoin tool like a cold card wallet versus a scam that's claiming they're holding my money. It sucks. I wish that there were ways for people to learn without going the hard way, but a lot of people were just telling me like, yeah, that, anything is a learning process. And so that's how they learn.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's a shame that has to happen. It's weird actually, because I must be like one of the very few people that I know that didn't shitcoin before they got to Bitcoin, because I just didn't. Yeah, I mean, not because I'm some kind of like moral crusader or anything like that. I mean, nobody could explain to me the point of Ethereum. And I asked a lot of people, and I
Yeah.
even went through a phase. I was volunteering for a company in Toronto, and they're called Bitcoin Bay, but they also do a lot of like altcoin stuff, like shitcoin stuff. And I did a podcast series for them talking to women in crypto. And so they were invariably women who were in the NFT space or something similar.
Yeah.
And I asked every single one of them, I was like, can you explain to me why Ethereum and not Bitcoin or whatever? And I just never got a satisfactory answer. And I would look at it and I'd be like, but this just looks exactly like fiat, but it's just on a blockchain. To me, it's almost indistinguishable in terms of what it does. So yeah, I always find it strange that it holds such an appeal for reasons that I can't really quite fathom. I wanted to talk about your involvement with women in this space, because you've done some really interesting work. I mean, apart from Des Femmes, which you run, obviously, and that does a lot of fantastic work in the space as well. But you also put together a whole book, Cypherpunk Women, that you very kindly sent with your notes, which was fascinating. How did that happen?
That was a hobby project, definitely a labor of love. And it came from a place of annoyance that I had so many people telling me they didn't know any other women who liked Bitcoin. And I knew so many. So I sent out a bunch of emails asking people who are women and like Bitcoin if they wanted to write why and what their experiences were like. And how it is they came into the space. And now we have an open source anthology. People can read it online for free. And if you want to buy it in print, because that's how people relate to books too, it's from BookBaby. They print it only when people order it, so that could be in perpetuity. It kind of lives on its own. There are more than 30 women who are involved in contributing to that anthology. I think it's closer to 34, but I just always say more than 30 because I can't remember if it's exactly 32 or 34. We hosted a VR book launch party during the pandemic featuring 4 speakers from different backgrounds, including one from Iran who was talking about her experiences using Bitcoin in Iran. Wow. Now that project mostly stands on its own. I do have a GitHub repo for my own essay in case people want to add names to the list of women cypherpunks who have been a part of this history. So anyone is welcome to submit a pull request to my Cypherpunk Women repo on GitHub, and I update that repo. And in the list itself, there's like way more women than actually contributed to the anthology. So I wanted people, the next time they ask, I don't know any other women who are interested in Bitcoin, I can just point them and say, look and read all the different reasons why these women are interested in Bitcoin.
I mean, it's really fascinating. I wish I'd had hold of this a year ago, because when I started doing my podcast for similar reasons to you, where, I was kind of like, are there any women in this space? And then the more women I spoke to, they'd invariably introduce me to a friend of theirs and be like, oh, you should interview so-and-so, or whatever. Yeah. And then I was like, oh my God, there's a ton of women in this space. You just never hear from them. And some of them were very reluctant to do a podcast. I'd get answers like, I don't really have anything to talk about. And, I don't want to dox who it was, but, it's like, these are people who are running amazing companies in the Bitcoin space. And I'm just like, do you know how many men go on podcasts who have done nothing of worth in their lives?
Yeah. That's, I think, a common issue in our gender, that we discredit our own knowledge. Like, oh, I don't know anything. I promise the guys didn't either, until they tried and then they learned.
Yeah. And I mean, also just not recognizing like the contribution that you have, or that your story might be interesting, which I always find fascinating. Could you talk about some of the standout ones? Because some of the names in the list I know quite well, like Hannah Rosenberg and Amber Scott, for example. I know she introduced me to Hannah Rosenberg, actually. And, Lisa Nygaard, obviously, and various different people. But can you talk about some of the sort of players, I guess, and some of their works?
Yeah, I'm actually going to mention 2 people that use pen names, because for me, they stood out quite a bit. They were 2 people who submitted poems. And one was a woman who saved Bitcoin and was a domestic violence survivor. And it was really a part of her journey in terms of being able to store money for herself as she was earning her freedom and restarting her life. And the other one was a woman who used Bitcoin to help a family member in Iran get an emergency surgery, or I don't remember surgery. I think it was cancer medication, actually. Yeah, cancer medication they needed, but that was difficult to acquire in Iran. It was difficult to send that much money to get the kinds of medical treatments they needed. In terms of somebody who is definitely named, Suna Amaz, for example, she's a VC who has an engineering background. And she really likes the longevity of Bitcoin as an asset class to invest in, and as a sector of the economy to invest in. As an investor, she's looking for startups that will have growth over the next 10 years. So as you can see, there's three completely different women who come from very different backgrounds, and they were interested in Bitcoin for very different reasons.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I might use that list to reach out to some of them to interview for the podcast then, because I was like, gosh, this is such an amazing resource.
Yeah,
All
very
these
good.
people. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the journey that you've seen Bitcoin go through? Because you've been writing about it for, really, I mean, relatively speaking, obviously it's a very new asset class, but you've been writing about it for an incredibly long time. Do you sort of recall in the early days, if you want to call it that, like in 2015 when you started writing, or 2016, do you recall how the ecosystem felt then, and what the discussions were, and which things were being debated?
I was very casual in 2015, so I wasn't as tuned in to the Bitcoin community and ecosystem itself as I was into a very particular use case, which I was focused on darknet markets. And that can be both, I focused particularly on the sex industry, and my colleague who I was working with focused on terrorists, actually, and researching whether or not and how terrorists were using Bitcoin. At the time, ISIS was really the group that we were focusing on as researchers. So I knew less about what was going on in terms of technical development, and was really focused on, as a researcher, those two particular aspects. I learned very quickly that sex workers know more about Bitcoin than really your average engineer. And that's because they were so sharp, and they were all into the different custody tools. They understood the issues with tracking their transactions. And this is because you can get your bank account shut down, even if what you're doing as a sex worker is perfectly lawful. And so when I was looking at how Bitcoin was impacting the sex industry, mostly people were using it for saving for retirement, for example, or for their children's college fund. Things where if they want to get from a client $100,000 in one transaction, which is something that you can do if you're a high-end escort,
really?
That could be. I promise it's not as easy as it sounds, but you could. You totally could, and that will get a bank to flag you so fast. Your head will spin. A bank will. They will not love that. But that's your kid's college fund. So that's how I was seeing sex workers use it. In terms of terrorists, they were very bad at using it. They kept thinking that it was completely anonymous, and forgetting that when they were cashing it out using institutions that collected their KYC information, they would get caught. I think at the time we were still talking about just a few $1,000s in terms of fundraising, and it was very difficult for them on the ground because ISIS at the time, a lot of the places they were operating didn't have great internet connection. So people who are always worried about terrorist financing in Bitcoin, things have obviously changed a lot, but the fundamental point remains that actually the terrorists are not very good at using Bitcoin, and the people who are much better at using Bitcoin tend to be civilians. I think that's simply because they're not overly confident. A sex worker might question herself and make sure she's triple checking a transaction 3 times before she's doing it. While a lot of times the militant generals who are making these command decisions are just used to barking out orders, and they don't really stop to think about what kind of information they might be leaking when it is they're transacting or cashing out.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me that they try and smear Bitcoin by saying that it will be used by terrorists. And I'm like, if terrorists are using it, you're lucky because you can actually track a lot of what they're doing,
Yes, exactly.
God, that's really fascinating.
I mean, back then, just in the circles that I was working in, which was, not necessarily entirely Bitcoin savvy, but was more researchers and journalists, it was very edgy. Bitcoin was seen as challenging technology that not everyone could use. And I think that today, one thing that's changed a lot is that we now know and understand that actually you don't need a high level of technical competence to use Bitcoin once or twice. You might need a high level of technical competence in order to do something complex, in order to, store your life savings there. That would just be for your comfort level. You'd want to be understanding how computer science works. But back then it was really like you would talk about it like it was rocket science. And today I think we all understand that people can have an app on their phone that they use to transact with Bitcoin. So in that way, it's become much more mainstream, much more accessible. And the other thing is the kinds of people that we associate with Bitcoin. Back then, a lot of times people associated with criminals. Today, people still do incorrectly when they're new to the space, for sure. But we can also point to Jack Dorsey, and we can also point to Michelle Phan, who's a makeup influencer. So we have much more public figures that are mainstream public figures that are family friendly that we associate with technology today that just weren't outspoken back in 2015.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very, very true. It's definitely a bit more respectable, but I still hear people make really ridiculous comments with regards to Bitcoin, which is frustrating and sad oftentimes. I'm curious about your journalistic methods, actually, obviously, without going into too much detail if it's stuff that's sensitive. But when you're writing about things like terrorists and hookers, basically, like, or sex workers,
Yeah.
how do you find these people and get them to talk to you? I mean, like, you're already like dealing with Bitcoin, which is already maybe for them a sensitive subject. And then their line of, I mean, I'm not saying your colleague necessarily spoke to the terrorists. I don't know how they did their research, but how do you find these people and get them to open up and have a conversation with you?
I wish I had a secret that was really complex, but the honest answer is you ask people to introduce you and give you a warm intro. So I went to conferences for porn stars, for example.
Oh, is that a thing?
A lot of people. It is a thing. Yeah, just like any industry. You can go to an AI conference, you can go to a porn star conference. And obviously I was accredited journalist, so it's not like anyone from the street can walk in. But also as a woman, I was a little bit less threatening, right? Like to just walk up to a performer and ask her, how does she deal with her health insurance? How does she deal with her retirement? Like, and especially because I was asking her, like treating her like a business person. People were quite warm to that. And then I would ask, if you use Bitcoin, do you know any other performers here who might use Bitcoin? And they might introduce me. The same applies, although less of in a conference setting, for anyone who's involved with political activities, or even like military activities. You meet people and then you ask for warm introductions as much as you can. If you're having trouble meeting people because you don't, go to an ISIS conference 101, a lot of times you would go online first, and they have Twitter and Instagram and Facebook just like anybody else. So then you can usually find out from there, like, who are people they know, where areas that they go. And I personally did not handle any direct interviews, I think, with anyone in that background. But generally, if you're looking for people who are hard to find, the answer is it takes longer, not that there's a different method. The same method is you earn somebody's trust, and then you ask them to introduce you to somebody else. And with that warm intro, it gets a little bit quicker each time.
Gosh, that's really fascinating. What's the most interesting use case you saw back then in terms of using Bitcoin?
I thought the refugee camp one was pretty fascinating.
Sorry, is that where they were just receiving money in the refugee camp using Bitcoin?
Accounts, but they do know how to jerry rig their own light bulbs and power. So they were able to hook up small Bitcoin mining machines, and that made a huge life-changing difference for some people in that area who otherwise, had no. I talk about technical background. They didn't go to college. They did not have the kind of educational background that you would usually associate with a high level of technical competence. But they had a need, and need is really the mother of invention.
Sorry, I think the line cut out slightly when you started telling the story then. Was this the one where they were mining Bitcoin in a basement?
Yeah.
Right.
In a refugee camp. I really thought that was an inspiring and interesting use case.
Did they just mine it using a regular computer back then, or did they actually have an ASIC that they'd got hold of?
This wasn't that long ago. This was like 2018 was the last time I heard about that. I think last time I checked with them, they're no longer mining in that location. They got a hold of an ASIC, to be honest. A lot of times in places like Venezuela or some other areas with, I guess, poorer access to technical equipment, you get older equipment. But Bitcoin miners sell off their stuff when there's better and newer equipment to use. So the older stuff kind of floats around, and eventually somebody might know somebody who had a deal that they could offer. It comes in a box, like the same way that you would get like a nice TV if you didn't get it from Amazon. You just buy it and try and fix it up so that it works in your setup.
That's really incredible. So how do you see the trajectory then in terms of the technology? I mean, you touched on the fact that obviously everybody's more familiar with using apps and that kind of stuff, but the debates I think that go on an ecosystem have changed a lot. So like ordinals has been a big thing over the last year, where that's been just consumed a massive amount of people's time on Twitter. I think of sort of things that are pertinent, like the lack of decentralization with mining pools. Like, what kind of themes have you seen change over the last sort of 8 to 10, well, I guess 8 years?
I guess a lot, at least from my perspective, they're actually the same themes, but with different names associated with them. So a lot of the debate around ordinals, right, is how to use block space properly, how we can scale the technology to include more information and more transactions without increasing the fees. That's very comparable to the debates that were happening around SegWit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not an exact comparison, but like the concept of how do we make this more efficient so more people can use it without having fees skyrocket? That's the debate that we're having. And we've just now have weird JPEGs associated with this debate, as opposed to before there were technical changes associated with the debate.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, what was the other thing you mentioned in addition to ordinals?
The decentralization of the mining pools, or lack of, I should say.
Oh, well, that's always been an issue, right? Decentralization is what makes Bitcoin unique compared to other cryptocurrencies. And so nothing is ever perfect. It's a journey. And I think, maybe today it will be mining pools and tomorrow it will be hardware wallet producers. They're still concentrated in quite just a few companies and a few people. But every cycle, we will have new debates about decentralization and how it is that we can progress it forward and what is actually a hindrance to progressing it forward. And I think that's a healthy thing.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. It's interesting. I mean, having only been in the space really for like, what is it now, 2.5 years? I mean, it feels like forever in some ways, but I'm just conscious that there's a lot of like what I would call OGs who've been around, some of them since really like early 2009, 2010.
Yeah, some people a really long time.
Yeah, some have been, but I also noticed that many of the people that were in this space originally have dropped out. So for example, when I started doing the podcast, I would sort of source different podcasts and look at who was being interviewed. And there were some women, and there was one, I forget her name, but she was a Canadian lady, and she has completely disappeared off the radar, like completely. I can't find her. I've asked loads of people.
Her. That's the dream.
Well, so I guess that's one of my questions, because it's funny, really. I mean, I feel like, a lot of us, when we discover this, our main sort of obsession is telling everybody about it. It just becomes like this thing where you feel the need to share this. Do you think that that's something that wears off after a while? Like, do people just get tired of trying to educate people, or do they just feel that they've reached a point where, I don't know, they've stacked enough and they just want to go and live a quiet life somewhere and drop out of public life in some way?
I do think that, it really depends on your personality. So there are some people who really thrive on social settings and public teaching, and they may never get tired of it. Jimmy Song is a great example of somebody who's been in this space a very, very long time and never gets tired of teaching. So definitely there's a lot of people who want to continue being public figures in the Bitcoin space and may for the rest of their lives. Personally, I am only as public as I need to be for my job and in order to gain access to education. Because as somebody who did not have a computer science background, the way that I learned was by going up to people who were way smarter than me and asking them questions. And the more they recognized my face, the more likely they were to give me their time.
Yeah.
So I do think that eventually, for example, with my own family and stuff, I've stopped trying to convince anybody. I really don't care. Like, if you believe me or you don't, like, if you ask me questions, I'm happy to answer and I'm happy to provide resources, but I'm also not here to argue with you. If you don't believe me, then I'm not here to convince you. And so maybe there's a lot of people who, like me, um, are happy to answer questions, but no longer driven by this need to convince other people because they don't need to convince themselves either. They're fully confident in what they know.
Yeah, I think a lot of it for me was just like, oh, there's this lifeboat and I need to get everybody onto it. And then I do feel like at some point you sort of reach a point where you're like, okay, I can give you the information, but you actually need to save yourself and
Yes.
make a decision to do that. And if you decide not to, or because you don't think it's worthwhile or you don't have any interest, then, can't really help you at this point. So let it go kind of thing. But I do find that I would talk obsessively about Bitcoin all day and all night if I could. I mean, if I was surrounded by people that wanted to talk about Bitcoin, I think that's all we would talk about.
I mean, that's awesome. I think it's fun to talk about anything that you enjoy learning about, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think that's necessarily unique to Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is just something that we're all constantly having to learn about because it is itself evolving. And that's what makes it fun to talk about.
I find it a really strange topic. It's just obsessively interesting. I mean, I can honestly say that I was never this interested in traditional finance, like not even close. And I've puzzled a lot why, but I think it's probably because, to be honest, TradFi just never made any sense. Like it was abundantly clear now that I look back on it in some ways that it was just a completely broken, dysfunctional, nonsensical system. And when you learn about Bitcoin and how much sense it makes, and then you see how much it affects every facet of everybody's life, it just becomes like this really deeply interesting topic on so many levels. It's really hard to, I think it's really hard to communicate that to somebody that hasn't had the experience themselves. It's just really difficult to explain why it's so interesting, to me at
Yeah.
least. I wanted to ask you about Des Femmes then. Can you talk about why you founded that and what the objective is and some of the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, sure. So actually, it came out of a conversation with Camila Russo. She's the founder of the Defiant. She's much more well known in the Ethereum community, but we're both journalists, and we were having this conversation, realized that we both thought that there is demand among women for content about business and finance, in particular, content about crypto that doesn't treat it as if steaks and beer are the only things that can be associated with it. I personally love steak, so I'm not anti-steak. But I also like tea parties, and I think it can be really fun to just have a brunch and talk about Bitcoin. So it was actually Camila Russo who raised the initial crowdfunding round, and I bet her at the time that it wouldn't work. I was like, there's no way that people are going to want to pay for content about Bitcoin that's specifically for women. And I was wrong. I was proven wrong. And then she's like, okay, well, now that we have a little bit of money, now what? I can say that over the past 3 years, we've spent and closed out all of the accounts associated with those crowdfunding rounds. So that aspect of the project is done. But what came and was born of it is this online group that has created mentorship programs, events. We've gotten together and learned how to use multi-sig together, for example. That was new for me and definitely a learning experience. Learned how to use different like wallets types. And I think learning together makes it less scary. So
Yeah.
now it's much more of a grassroots organization, and we continue to stay in touch online. We'll probably meet up in July around the Bitcoin conference. So very low key, but also very special to have a group of people who you have this common passion with. And as you said, just wanting to talk about Bitcoin all day, like, who do you talk about it with? You can talk about it with your friends and with people who want to collaborate with you on different weird tech experiments, like learning how to run a lightning node.
That's amazing. Do you know, it's so funny. I didn't realize Camila Russo was associated with that. So I actually know her because her husband went through the accelerator program that I ran at Barclays.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's so funny. And before I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, we had because we ran the program online because it was during like the pandemic stuff going on, and we had I think it was June 2021. We had a dinner so that everybody could actually meet in person because none of us had pretty much met in person. Although I think actually I might have met Camila before. because we were all living in New York at the time. So I think her and her husband brought their dog to the park, and we had a walk around the park with their dogs, during kind of the
Oh,
lockdowny
lovely.
phase. Yeah. But it was funny because I remember sitting at this dinner with her, and this would have been, actually, do you know, this would have been, funnily enough, right before I got orange pilled. It was probably about 2 months before it. I think it was June 2021. And I
Oh,
remember her,
wow.
yeah, and I remember her sitting there and all sweetly sort of saying to her, yeah, I'm a journalist at Bloomberg. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I used to work at Bloomberg. And then she's like, yeah, and I've written a book about, Ethereum. And I was just like, oh, that's nice. Like, just kind of like, whatever. Yeah, sure. So that sounds interesting. And then I actually ended up reading the book. So I think I must have read it October 2021, The
Oh,
Infinite Machine. Was it The Infinite Machine? Yeah. So it was really interesting. I learned a lot about Ethereum through that book, actually, because I was like, oh, I really need to kind of do a bit of a deep dive here. But that's so funny that, her husband's awesome, actually. He's been such a great help to me in so many ways on my journey, just, having gone through being a founder.
yeah.
I used to kind of reach out to him quite regularly and be like, how did you deal with this problem?
They're a great power couple. There's a lot of power couples in the space.
Yeah, definitely. They really are. And I guess they're both quite aligned in terms of what they're doing as well, business wise. But yeah, she's so sweet and unassuming, and then has done like so much between founding the Defiant and then, writing a book. And I was just like, wow, you're so kind of unassuming, I guess is the word I'd use.
Down to earth, yeah, I would say.
Yeah.
Me and her have very different opinions on Ethereum, and I think that's entirely okay. Personally, I really like makeup and different kinds of face serums, and I know that a lot of times I'm wasting my money trying a new serum, and I accept that as an adult, and I feel that way about Ethereum. That if people want to have, fun things that they're like comfortable wasting or spending, it's not wasting, it's spending. I'm allocating funds for my own enjoyment, then I think Ethereum products can be a really great fit for you. There's a lot of other people who view it more as an investment vehicle or as the future of finance. I think that I personally feel more comfortable with Bitcoin in that regard, but I'm not anti if other people want to spend their money on their digital serums. That seems completely safe to me.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I just think it's a technology like any other. And if you want to play around with it, then that's absolutely fine to play around with it. I think I used to be a bit perplexed as to why Bitcoiners would say Bitcoin, not crypto. And I'm like, but it's a cryptocurrency. What do you mean?
Yeah.
And I understand
Yeah.
now why they try to make the distinction, because I would identify as a maxi, really. I don't object to Ethereum. I just don't see the point of it, I think is how I describe it. I'm like, it's fine, but it's sort of like, eating McDonald's when you could go and have a grass-fed steak instead. That's a bad analogy,
Exactly.
but
No, I completely agree with that. And I also think Bitcoiners are so frustrated with being associated with something that involves a lot of scams that they keep, like you said, saying Bitcoin, not crypto, but it's a little bit like saying soap, not skincare. Because
yeah,
soap is part of skincare. It is the most important part. You shouldn't try and replace other parts of skincare with soap. You want to use soap. But if other people want to use random serums or, face masks or whatever in addition to soap, which is fundamental, then by all means, enjoy your toys.
yeah. I do think these purity tests are a little bit ridiculous. I find them just ridiculous. That's the only word that I can really use for it. I'm just like, look, at the end of the day, you don't have to stop being friends with somebody because they happen to invest in a product you don't agree with or whatever. It's just, yeah, it seems a bit excessive.
I feel like we've also lost a little bit of the ability to say that I don't like something. I personally don't want to use something. And that's okay. I'm okay with other people making a different choice than I've made. We do the same thing in the Bitcoin space when it comes to self-custody versus custodial wallets.
True.
For a lot of people, custodial wallets are great. I had a test with my parents, who I no longer talk with about crypto, in which if they were able to keep in self-custody, like it was like $50 at the time, worth of Bitcoin for 1 year, then I would answer their questions as to what else they could be doing with it in its investment term. My father failed the test, so we don't talk about Bitcoin anymore. That's how it works. Like, custodial wallets are the way for you, and that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a journey, isn't it? Because people say, oh, how hard is it to write 12 words down, on a piece of paper? And it's like, yeah, I suppose. I mean, when you look at it in those terms, but what if you lose the piece of paper? What if I
Yeah.
don't know, like house burns down and you lose it? It's not just that kind of simple thing. Um, so I do think that sort of judginess of like, I mean, I sometimes read things on Twitter where people are like, if you're not running a node, you're not a real Bitcoiner. And I'm just like, there's security issues with running a node, firstly. So if you're doing it, you should probably have
Hmm.
some, vaguer idea at least of what you're doing and how to do it securely.
Hmm.
And, I mean, yeah, it's like, yeah, it's great if you can and you're willing to, but I think to get annoyed with people because they've decided not to do that, then is kind of silly. And the same thing with Bitcoin mining. I mean, great if you want to stick a miner in your home, but maybe you can't, for whatever the reasons might be above. So
Yeah, it's expensive. It can take a lot of electricity. It's hot
yeah.
sometimes, depending on what kind of miner you have. Perfectly fine to decide that that's not an avenue you want to go down.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. I'm interested to talk to you about what you see then as sort of, I guess, this is a bad way of phrasing it, but like women's roles in Bitcoin, because obviously they're the same as men's roles in Bitcoin. But where do you see the involvement of women increasing? Because I mean, I don't know if I'm
Oh
just in a bit
yeah.
of a, you agree? I was going to say, I don't know if I'm in a bit of an echo chamber now where I talk to so many women in the Bitcoin space that I just assume that there's thousands of us. But it feels to me like they're not only increasing in number, but also becoming more vocal. Would you agree?
Definitely. And there's not only thousands of us, there's literally millions of us.
Yeah.
Um, FINRA in the US had a report that showed 19% of Gen Z reported having used crypto at some point. There's a JP Morgan study, I think it was 2 years ago, that estimated 20% of millennials have used crypto. So if you're assuming 20% of millennials in the US, roughly 20% of Gen Z in the US, that's millions of people. So
Yeah.
I think that people talk about, mainstream adoption, quote unquote. That can mean different things to different people, but we might already be there. If you can trade Bitcoin on Cash App and 20% of the younger generation, and not even that much younger, we're millennials are adults now, parents with mortgages, are using a particular asset, then that's pretty mainstream. And that means that there's millions of women around the world. There's all different kinds of studies for different countries, obviously, in different regions. But I think that we are much more prominent than we are portrayed in crypto Twitter or in media reports, for example.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that because I was quite surprised yesterday to see Trump make a statement. I saw a clip of it on Twitter, saying about CBDCs. I don't know if you'd seen that, but basically saying that,
Ooh.
you don't want yeah. I thought this is interesting now because like now are all the hardcore Bitcoiners going to feel compelled to vote for him, even if they don't like him. He came out basically and said CBDC. I'm paraphrasing, but CBDCs are a bad idea, and they will give government control of your money. And if I'm president, I'm not going to allow that to happen. And that was kind of it, really, in a nutshell. But I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting now.
Very cool.
Yeah, so you've got him and you've got obviously Kennedy. So Ramaswamy has dropped out. So he's actually, that was the other thing that the announcement that, or whatever, the speech that Trump gave. He basically, Vivek Ramaswamy came on stage and they did lots of backslapping and he said he's going to be working with them. He didn't say he was going to be a possible VP candidate, but I think that he'll be helping Trump with his campaign now, which is
Yeah,
interesting.
I mean, we've reached an age in which a lot of world leaders really understand Bitcoin. Whether or not they like it is a totally different question, but understand it, that on some ways is a kind of mainstream adoption. In other areas of the world, for example, Putin, Vladimir Putin in Russia, he gets it. If you ever see interviews, he's talking about how he can't control it. He doesn't like that. And you're like, oh, yes, you understand the technology then. Like it or not, you get it. If your problem with it is you cannot control it. And Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel is another example of a world leader who, when you see his interviews, and I don't think they've translated many of them into English, but from what I watched, and I speak a little bit of Hebrew, he was really explaining how it's different than what a central bank digital currency would be, and he gets it. Like he understands what he's talking about. So whether or not a world leader likes it, the fact that we now have presidential candidates, prime ministers, all different kinds of world leaders who are able to describe the technology and how it would impact or relate to their policies, that's a kind of adoption.
Yeah, I think you're right. We probably have reached critical mass. I think probably the mainstream media's kind of last throes of criticizing it is just like that last sort of desperation of trying to kind of sway public opinion. But you're probably right, just in terms of the sheer numbers. I think at this point, it's, you can't really have 20% of the population who hold an asset that you then criminalize and suddenly, a fifth of everybody in your country is de facto a criminal. I mean, that just wouldn't work in practice. So it'd be interesting to see, I think, this year.
It definitely can get bigger. Like, I'm not saying that it won't grow, but I remember we were talking about, 2015 and 2016. I just remember a time in which you didn't know anyone who owned Bitcoin. You had to go looking for them. And today, if you go to a party and you were to get everyone and line them up and ask them, do you know about it? Have you tried it before? You would probably get like a handful of people who have tried doing something, even if it was just trading on Coinbase. So that in a way is a kind of, mainstreaming of an asset class.
Yeah, you're right. That is very much so. It was interesting as well when you were talking about the statistics. I was just thinking, how many people do you know that own gold? I mean, I certainly don't know 20% of my friends who own gold, but I could, well, obviously I'm in a bit of a Bitcoin echo chamber. So there's a lot of people I know that own Bitcoin, but you're right. There's much more adoption of that just in the sheer numbers. Which country then? Because I mean, you've got quite a good international insight then, having seen, and the Middle East, I feel like, at least in crypto more generally, maybe less Bitcoin specifically, but it's flying ahead of other jurisdictions. Like, how do you sort of see when you look at the adoption globally? Because I mean, I don't live in the UK anymore, but I have some insight into the UK. And they made a big show of being like, oh, we're going to be this crypto friendly jurisdiction. And they've basically done the complete opposite to what would actually be conducive of becoming a crypto-friendly jurisdiction. So I'm just curious, and Canada's quite far ahead in some respects in the sense that they had an ETF a long time before the US did, and I think since February 2021. For the size of the population, there's really good adoption here. There's really good knowledge. Like, there's some very prominent Bitcoiners who are very kind of deep into this space. Obviously, the US is leading the pack because America innovates, and it's just, to me, that's the reason why it's just taken off so well there, because it's so culturally ingrained. But how do you see it? Because I mean, you've got a much broader, deeper lens than I have.
So I don't have anywhere that I would, maybe Singapore actually, that I'd point to that I'd say the government is very pro cryptocurrency in their legislation. But places where people, I mean, like Lebanon, for example, I would say it's relatively common. It's widely respected and used, and that has a big deal. It's a big impact on that is the fact that their banking system is absolutely in utter collapse. It has been for a long time. In terms of countries that sure have economic issues but are not in complete economic disarray, India, for example, which has this huge population of highly technical, both men and women, who travel a lot internationally. They have a lot of family that's international. I would say that Bitcoin is much more popular in India than most people expect. Let's see, what other countries? I mean, obviously, there's a lot in Latin America. Argentina, for example, Bitcoin is very popular and well known. So I would say that, I mean, there's still a long way to go, but that the U.S. is definitely not leading when it comes to civilian usage. It might just be in terms of sheer dollar amounts, like a lot of rich people, venture capitalists, and other kinds of investors, family offices that have the time and the resources to look into Bitcoin and figure out how it fits into their portfolios.
Which jurisdiction do you think is leading in terms of the technology? Then, if you think the US doesn't necessarily lead in terms of like individual adoption, would you say that they're doing well in terms of companies that are developing products around there, or are there other jurisdictions that are really kind of, hitting the ball out of the park?
I mean, I do believe that a lot of US-based companies are doing a great job when it comes to developing Bitcoin-related technology. The Block or Spiral, there's so many different names associated with Jack Dorsey's companies. They have a new hardware wallet coming out that's really cool. Cold Card is a Canadian company, so up near you.
Yeah.
I think in North America, we do have some pretty great companies in the Bitcoin ecosystem. But I think that in terms of like developer talent, there's a lot of developer talent in Europe that is maybe quieter, less boisterous than their American counterparts, but very active. And so where the developer talent is, companies eventually follow. So if I was an investor, I'd be very curious to just watch and see what's going on in European countries.
Yeah, I mean, I was quite interested in the sort of lineup that BTC Prague had because it was very like nerd focused. Like there were a lot of builders there. And that really struck me that I thought Eastern Europe is probably, I mean, like when I used to work in TradFi, I just remember going to Eastern Europe and it was like not very long, obviously, after the Iron Curtain had fallen. And it was interesting to see that where systems had collapsed and there was kind of like a greenfield space, like technology adoption was much quicker, like the population just embraced technology. I mean, I was working in e-trading, so it was kind of my area, I guess, if you like, but you could just see that they were just much more quick to adopt new systems and ways of doing things. And I wonder if it's a similar thing with Bitcoin because they're not as encumbered by these hundreds and hundreds of years old banking systems that are just very entrenched, where they're able to kind of adapt and build much quicker on it.
I definitely could see that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Be really interesting. I mean, I'm just blown away by some of the stuff that's being built by companies. I love like researching into them and looking into them because I used to work in corporate innovation and I'm like, oh my God, this is so interesting. They're doing this and how's that going to change everything? It's really quite an exciting time to be alive, I feel.
So we've covered the entire globe and maybe like 7 or 8 years of Bitcoin history. What else? There's so much to say. Is there anything else in particular that for you is just really top of mind, something you're curious about, or something that you're really excited about when it comes to this year in the Bitcoin space?
I mean, my big obsession right now, I'll be honest, is Nostr because I feel like it's taking Bitcoin up to that social layer. So I'm just really excited about the marriage between that and the Lightning Network because I think it's just going to change everything. And really kind of,
cool.
Yeah, and just kind of liberate, communication, really kind of, I guess, enforce free speech in a way that we're just not able to do effectively through legislation. I'd say probably that's my big excitement. How about you? Where do you think this is going?
I like that Nostr answer. I'm pretty into Nostr. It's cool. I was pretty disappointed recently when Wallet of Satoshi decided to block American users. I get why, but I think that climate of over compliance is exactly the thing that makes me oscillate between being bullish and bearish on Bitcoin. It's on one hand, Bitcoin is an amazing tool. On the other hand, regulators and politicians make it really difficult for those of us who are trying to use it. So I guess we'll see how it plays out over the next 10 years in terms of if it becomes economical to use it for social networking and transactions, or if the amount of time and effort that requires eventually outweighs the benefits.
Yeah, I don't know how into astrology you are. I mean, I'm not really, but I have a friend who is, she's a hodler, but she's not like obsessed with Bitcoin maybe in the way that I am, but she is obsessed with astrology. And she keeps telling me that like, oh, we're moving into this age of Aquarius. And she said, we're now at the final phases where like the centralized systems are breaking down and everything's becoming decentralized. And this is like the last struggle of the centralized systems trying to maintain control. And I find it sometimes a little bit hard to take this stuff seriously. But then I listen to her talk and I'm like, damn, like you're really calling it though with the climate.
It's not wrong. Whether it's the stars or something else, there is definitely a breakage happening.
Yeah, I think this year is the we fight you year. I think we'll really feel like the screws turning, but I do think it's inevitable. I mean, it's such an amazing technology that I just think now it's out of the Pandora's box. You can't pop it back in, it just won't happen. So I would love to just like have you wrap up maybe with one last thought then, and also just any advice that you would give particularly to women who are interested in this space, because you've done a lot of work with women, and I'd love to get your thoughts on how you think they should and could get involved and why they should get involved.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of wrap up thoughts, people can continue to follow me or reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at LA__CUEN. On Instagram, I'm just my name. So LEIGHCUEN. As you mentioned, I have a Substack. So leighcuen.substack.com. Leigh Cuen being spelled LEIGHCUEN. In terms of my last piece of advice, if there's only one thing I could tell other women Bitcoiners around the world, it would be to not be afraid to fail on your own. I think one of the things I'm the most grateful for is that when I discovered Bitcoin, I was with a boyfriend at the time who hated it and just wanted nothing to do with it and thought it sucked. And the reason that was so good for me is because I couldn't turn to him the way I did with my phone or computer when it was broken and be like, what's wrong with this? Because he would just not deal with it. So it meant I had to deal with the issues. And trust me when I say I burned through 3 different hardware wallets trying to learn how, and I got my tiger stripes in terms of losing coin, and I opened a Coinbase account and closed it because I hated it so much, and all the things. But because I did it all on my own before I made a lot of friends in this space when I was just like a journalist who was researching this thing and I wanted to use it in order to be good at my job. I know that I can self-custody. I have the choice of custody options. Like everyone now, we have the choice. We have ETFs, we have custodial apps like Cash App, but I know I'm capable and I don't need anyone else to give me permission to hold my own Bitcoin. And that would only be possible in a context where you're comfortable or willing to fail. So I guess my advice to other women Bitcoiners is tell yourself you're going to start with small amounts. You're not trying to lose your life savings here, but it's okay. It's part of the process. And any highly technical, super cypherpunk engineer dude who you talk to, you tell him you lost coin, he's going to tell you he lost coin too. This is not something that's wrong with you. This is a part of your process as you figure out how to be your own bank.
Yeah, that's very good advice. That's really fantastic, actually. Thank you so much, Leigh. That's really great insights. And I'd just like to say congrats for your staying power, because you've been here longer than most people and you're still, pushing ahead and blazing a trail. So I guess thank you for your tenacity and energy and just for, I guess really bringing so many people into this space through the work that you do.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure being on your podcast.
Thank you.